Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Giacomo Manzoli, and as the head of the Department of the Arts of the University of Bologna, I'm going to take just 30 seconds to welcome you to the third and last day of this conference, DAMS Ieri, oggi, domani, DAMS yesterday, today, and tomorrow, dedicated to the arrival into the Italian University of new fields of study like visual arts, musicology, performing arts, film and media studies. Something happened here in Bologna from 1971, and due to great scholars such as Benedetto Marzullo, Umberto Eco, Paolo Fabbri, and the many others we mentioned in the previous sessions of the conference. Since one of the problems we are still trying to solve in Italy is how to actually connect the tradition of the studies with the educational dimension at school as more in general in the public sphere, we chose to start this morning with the keynote lecture of one of the most important British scholars, David Buckingham, who spent his entire academic career studying the relationship between childhood, youth, and popular culture in the perspective of media education, and who played a pivotal role in the development of the so-called media literacy, an articulated concept which includes the transmission of knowledge in an age dominated by digital mass media. It would be impossible for me to describe in a few minutes how important have been to me his books and essays, brilliant, clever, rigorous, and unconventional at the time. So I'll just thank from the heart Professor Buckingham for accepting our invitation, and I let him speak after a very short introduction by Elisa Farinacci. Thank you so much, Professor Buckingham, and Elisa, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Giacomo, to Giacomo Manzoli for this opportunity to introduce to you all David Buckingham, and he is Emeritus Professor at Loughborough University and visiting professor at King's College in London. He's currently a Leverhulme Trust Emeritus Fellow. He was for many years a professor of education at the Institute of Education at the University of London, where he was the founder and director of the Center for the Study of Children, Youth, and Media. In 2001, Professor Buckingham was elected a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and 4 years later, he was also elected Fellow of the British Academy. Professor Buckingham is a leading internationally recognized expert on children's and young people's interactions with electronic media and on media literacy and education. He has directed numerous research projects on these issues and has been a consultant for UNESCO, the United Nations, UNICEF, the European Commission, Ofcom, and the UK government. He is author, co-author, or editor of 30 books and over 220 articles and book chapters. His work has also been translated into many languages. Among his key publications, I would like to highlight Media Education, Literacy, Learning, and Modern Culture, and also Beyond Technology, Children's Leading in the Age of Digital Culture. And he's also going to release a new publication this year, Youth on Screen, Representing Youth, Young People in Film and Television. So without further ado, today his lecture is going to discuss the topic Media and Cultural Education in the Age of Digital Capitalism. So Professor Buckingham, thank you again for being with us this morning, and I leave the floor to you.
So, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I'm going to share my screen. Let me see now. Okay, is that okay? Good, okay. Yes, so I should say, first of all, yes, good morning. Normally, I would say thank you very much for inviting me to your lovely city, and it is so nice to be in Bologna in the sun, and Unfortunately, that is just a fantasy at the moment, maybe sometime in the future. But this morning I'm sitting in my study in my house in London. I'm going to talk about this title, Media and Cultural Education in the Age of Digital Capitalism. And I'm subtitling my talk, The Manifesto and Beyond. Last year, well, in fact, 2019, I published a book called The Media Education Manifesto, which is a very short book. As a manifesto, it's a campaigning book. It's a book that I hope will be widely read by people. This book is also in Italian now, so you can see there the cover of the Italian translation, which I think came out sometime in the middle of last year. What I want to do this morning is to talk through some of the key ideas from the manifesto, hopefully in quite a campaigning and forceful way. And I then want to talk a bit about where my thinking is going now. So perhaps further down the road, there will be another book, which might be called Culture, Education and Society, 1960 to 2030. Maybe I'll write that one, I'm not sure. But what I'm wanting to do, and you'll see from the title of that one, is in a way to look back. So my manifesto really looks forward. It looks forward to the world of digital media, digital culture, and where we might be going. But I think really, I also want to suggest we need to look historically in order to understand what's happening. So I have really 4 key ideas that I'm taking from the manifesto, and then towards the end, I will move on to the more recent material. Firstly, I'm wanting to suggest that we tend to think about young people and digital media in a very binary way. Either they're good for children or they're bad for children. And my argument is that really, this is much too simplistic. We actually need to look beyond this either or binary way of thinking. We need to have a sense of the bigger picture of what is happening. In the UK, media literacy has come on board as a possible response, maybe a solution to the difficulties, the challenges of the digital age. And I want to suggest that we need to be careful here. There is a danger of looking to media literacy as the quick fix, as the easy answer. And I want to argue that in a way, what we need is media education, not so much media literacy as a general aim, but media education, by which I mean sustained, systematic programs of teaching and learning. And for me, they need to happen in school. I think there can be a role for what happens outside the school, but for me, the school is still a crucial institution. And then finally on that, I want to argue that, well, we need education, but actually we also need regulation. We need to rethink how our media system is governed in the modern world. So those will be the 4 key ideas which I'll work through. And then, as I say, I will come on later on to some of the stuff I'm thinking about at the moment. I think what I was saying before kind of implies that it's useful to look at history. I think we're in the last 4, 5 years, I think we're at a point of change really in how we think about digital media. I think we've really shifted in our thinking generally. And I think it's at that kind of point that in a way, it's really useful to look back to history. Some while ago, I read this really interesting book that I discovered called From Counterculture to Cyberculture. It's a book by Fred Turner, published in 2006, although it took me a long time to discover it. What Fred Turner does in this book is really to look at the history of digital media and specifically of the internet. And he does it by tracing the career of a man called Stuart Brand, who produced this book called The Whole Earth Catalogue If anyone here is old enough to remember the 1960s, the Whole Earth catalogue at the end of the 1960s, it was a kind of manual, a handbook for the hippies who were creating new kind of lifestyles. And Stuart Brand, who wrote this book, and in a way, this book is like the internet in a book. You can't see it from the picture, but it's a very large format book. It's like, you know, it's this sort of size. It's a big fat book, and it tries to get all the information in there. So it's like the internet in a book, in a way. And what's happened to Stuart Brand was that he went from being a key figure in the counterculture, in the hippie social movements of the 1960s, to becoming a kind of entrepreneur in the new digital environment, in the world of digital media and the internet. And in fact, you can trace that history in other people as well. Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, would be another example. You know, he goes from being a hippie idealist to being a digital entrepreneur. And there is a really interesting historical shift from the counterculture to the cyberculture. You can trace that historical line. And in a way, there are ideas that follow through, and there are ideas really about liberation, about empowerment. The old hippie slogan was power to the people. And the idea was that this new technology, this networked technology of the internet, would empower ordinary people. It would enable people to become creators, to become knowledge producers. It would really shift the power relationships of society. I think that kind of went down a little bit, but it then really resurfaced at the beginning of the millennium. So if you look in the early 2000s, as people were beginning to talk about Web 2.0, the participatory internet, the idea was that the participatory internet, or what we would now call social media, would empower ordinary people to become creative, expressive participants in society. And in a way, when you look back at this, you look historically, you can see that there's a strong element of fantasy about all of this. It's a very attractive fantasy, but it's a very deterministic one. The idea is somehow that technology will come from outside and it will change society, irrespective of how it's being used and who's using it. I think you can trace the same kind of utopian fantasies in education. This is a bit of Apple computer advertising, I think probably from the early 1980s. And what you had at that time was a similar kind of rhetoric used really to market technology, to sell technology to schools and teachers. And the idea was that this technology would transform learning. It would empower learners. It would empower teachers to do new and creative kinds of things. Again, I have to say, if you look at what has happened over the last 40 years, you would have to be somewhat more skeptical about this. In fact, the history of technology in education, one could argue, has been a history of failed promises. Every technology that comes along, people are making promises about how it will fundamentally change education. People said that about computers. They said that about television in the 1960s. They said that about film, the cinema, in the 1930s, that somehow technology would fundamentally change the institution of the school. I would say on one level, yes, it's true. Technology can be part of a broader pedagogical change that is happening, but it can also, and I think we know this now, it can also be used, and often is used, in quite limited, narrow, reductive kinds of ways. It's used often for testing rather than teaching. It's used to transmit knowledge rather than necessarily to make teachers or students more creative and active. And I think for me, the key issue is that the use of technology in school often does not connect with what is happening outside school. You look at how children use technology in school, and it's much more limited than what they're doing with technology outside school. Nevertheless, there's a history here. There's a history of this very positive story about how technology will make all of our lives better. It will transform society, transform the school. I think in the last 5 years or so, things have really shifted. The dream, the fantasy, the utopia of technology has shifted almost to a kind of nightmare, to something very bad. These are front papers from the British press, which is a wonderful institution. Sorry, I'm being ironical here, but you know, this is typical of the British newspapers. It's all about terrorism. It's all about the bad things that technology does for children. It's all about sex and violence, and a very familiar story in many ways. And I think in the last few years, what we've seen is a kind of backlash, or some people call it a tech-lash, a reaction against technology, where we're no longer talking about the utopian fantasy of the wonderful changes that will happen, but we're talking about all the bad things. Now, I think, you know, this has a history too. You can look back to the beginnings of the internet, and people were talking about pornography, people were talking about pedophiles and dangerous people online. But I think now we're talking in a much broader way about technology as a threat to society, particularly a threat to democracy, and also technology as a personal threat. Technology as a threat to our personal well-being. And if you were to look at the debates that go on around technology now, it seems to me that actually it's really shifted. This is the dominant concern these days. So of course we have the arguments about fake news, or post-truth, as it's sometimes called, disinformation, misinformation. We have concerns about radicalization of young people online. We have concerns about abuse, cyberbullying, hate speech. We have concerns about surveillance and how technology is being used to invade people's privacy, to gather data about them and to use that data. We have the more personal concerns that using technology, and particularly using social media, leads to narcissism, to depression, to addiction. It's bad for your mental health. And I think in many ways, yes, this is a familiar story. We've seen some of this before. You could look back to the arguments people were making about television and cinema, and actually before that. And in many ways, as media scholars, you know, we're used to this idea of the media panic, that people will often have a much broader set of concerns about what is going wrong with the world. And they put those concerns onto media, and they tell a story, which is that the media are to blame for everything that is going wrong. And to some extent, yes, that is what is happening. And to some extent, yes, we have seen it all before. We are very familiar with these kinds of concerns, and there is a danger of a massive kind of exaggeration and oversimplifying the challenges that are around in society and blaming the media for everything. But nevertheless, I think always with these kinds of concerns, there are broader changes happening. There are bigger things going on. There is a bigger picture happening here, and we need to understand that bigger picture. It's too easy to just dismiss it all as a panic, as an irrational response. So I've looked at positive ideas and negative ideas about the internet and technology. And my point in a way is that this is, you'll be familiar with this guy, this is Janus looking in both directions. In a way, what we have is a binary. And my point would be that it's not either or. These kinds of things are not either good or bad for us. There are risks and there are potentially benefits, and these things are connected. You can't have the benefits without the risks. You can't have the good things without the possible dangers. So those things are connected. And I think what research is finding is that the young people who are most techno-literate, they are using the technology to the highest extent and they're most skillful in using the technology, are also the young people who are most exposed to risk. So the risk and the benefit really goes together. My concern would be that in talking about whether we're talking about the risks or the benefits, the danger is that we look at the causes and we don't look at the symptoms. In a little while, I'll say something about fake news, but fake news is a very good example. People will look to fake news as the cause of all the problems in politics and the world now. And actually what we're doing there, I think, is we're looking at a symptom. We're not looking at the deeper causes, the deeper problems that may be there in politics, in society, and what is going on. And I would also want to argue that there is no educational quick fix. If we are concerned about these bad things that may be happening, there is not going to be a simple, easy solution. And education is not going to give us that simple, easy solution. Unfortunately, it is more complicated and more difficult than that. A lot of the discussion, it seems to me, is very narrowly focused. We focus only on spectacular kinds of risks, and we often focus on a concern about protection and safety, and we're not looking at the bigger picture. So it's this bigger picture that we need. So what do I mean? What bigger picture is this man talking about? Well, in a way, this is the bigger picture. It's what I called in my title, digital capitalism. Some people will call this communicative capitalism, platform capitalism, surveillance capitalism. You'll have heard some of these ideas. And basically, we're talking about an economic system that is about the gathering and selling of personal data. So when you go online, every click you make on your phone is giving data. There's a famous line here which says, if the service seems to be free, then you are the product, or your data is the product. So what's happening is we're getting, or we imagine we're getting something for free. We're getting Google, we're getting Facebook, and so on. But actually what we're doing is we're paying for that, and we're paying with our data. Our data is being gathered and analyzed, and then it's being used to sell things to us. It's a new economic model, and that is really how the system works. And we're talking about a relatively small number of companies which are effectively monopolies in their own markets. So if you look at social networking, Facebook absolutely dominates the market. Facebook is well over 90% of social networking. If you look at search, another basic function of online media, Google absolutely dominates that market to the point where we talk about Googling something. There are other search engines, there are other social networking sites. In some cases, as with Facebook, Facebook owns Instagram, Facebook owns WhatsApp. You have companies that have very cleverly bought up the competition in order to become effectively monopolies in their own market. Now, that's not to say that it's not risky. It's not to say that those companies will always be the dominant ones. I think, again, it's complicated, but at the moment we have a media system that is dominated by a small number of commercial companies. And what we also have is a world where our everyday lives, our social lives, our economy, our politics, commerce, culture, and also our intimate personal relationships are absolutely commercialized. They're driven by social media. Social media are everywhere. They are ubiquitous. We can't escape from them. And of course, they're ubiquitous because they allow for this kind of surveillance and data gathering. So that, in a way, is a very big picture. But it seems to me this is the challenge for education. I don't think it's enough for us to say, yes, we should be addressing internet safety. Actually, we need to be enabling young people to understand what is going on in this bigger picture. And I think there's quite a lot of evidence that says that actually adults don't really understand what is going on here. Young people actually may understand it a little bit more than adults, but actually we all need to understand it, and we need to learn about it. Now, it's in this situation that this idea of media literacy comes on board. I'm, as Elisa said at the beginning, all my career, I've been doing media education, and I have, you know, we're talking, well, I won't tell you how long, but for a long time, for many decades in Britain, we have been teaching about media in schools. It's a small area of the curriculum. It's pretty marginal, but we've been doing it for a long time. I started my career as a secondary school teacher, and I was teaching students a subject called media studies. This was at the end of the 1970s. It's only really in the last 20 years that people have begun to talk about media literacy as a kind of solution to some of the problems that are arising with digital media. I think we're in a situation where the governments in general are very reluctant to regulate and control digital media. They believe that, you know, the commercial market should be allowed to rule the way in which media are delivered. The market will somehow automatically produce good things. Regulation will be a problem. That is partly an ideological position, I would say, but it's also a recognition of the difficulty, you know, that we're talking here about global media companies. We're talking about technology that is very hard to control and to regulate. And of course, the companies, the Facebook and Google, etc., of this world, the companies don't want to be regulated because this will hit their profitability. So what happens then is that governments over the last 20 years have looked to media literacy. And I think we need some scare quotes here because they have a certain definition of media literacy, which I'll say a bit more about. But rather than regulating the market, what they want to do is to encourage people, individuals, to become media literate. In a way, what they're doing is they're passing the buck. They're saying this is not something that we should be doing or we can do. It's something that you, the individual, you, the consumer, should be responsible for. And also in that discussion, they of course look to education. And those of us who are teachers here will be very familiar with what I call educational solutionism. You know, we have a problem in society, teenage pregnancy, drugs, violence. And what we will always tend to do is to say, well, education is the solution. We need to be teaching young people about all these things, and that will make the problem go away. So what happens, it's a very familiar thing, is that, you know, government will then pass responsibility, not just to the individual, but also to educators. This is teachers' problem. This becomes teachers' problem. It's not the government's problem. And in a way, sometimes as educators, we say, yes, I can solve this problem. We see this as an opportunity. And certainly for us in media education, you know, as I've said, we're often quite marginal. It's a small area. And we suddenly think, oh, yes, you know, this is interesting. People have suddenly realized that actually what we've been saying for years and years is actually important. and they start to listen to us, not too hard, but they start to listen to us. And we think our time has come. And so we also buy into this, what I'm calling solutionism, this idea that education will solve the problem. And I want to suggest, I think there are some significant dangers in all of this, and we need to be careful about, as educators, how we engage with this discussion. In the UK, we had a new Communications Act in 2003. The media regulatory system was changed. A new regulator called Ofcom was created. This is a picture of the Ofcom building in London on the River Thames. And I think it's somehow symbolic. This building has an enormous, large stomach. And that tells you something about Ofcom. I think it's a bureaucracy. And Ofcom was given responsibility to promote media literacy, again, very much as an alternative to regulation. It's important to say the government was really stepping back from regulation. It was looking to media literacy as the answer. And it was making this move of saying, it's you, the individual, it's you, the consumer, who are going to be responsible for this. And often the talk here was about consumers rather than citizens. It was within a very market-defined way of thinking about media and culture. And what happened, and this is one thing that I think we need to be careful of, we as educators said, oh, this is great, this is our opportunity. But in fact, what happened was the discussion about media literacy became in the end a discussion about internet safety and a discussion about access, a discussion particularly about getting disadvantaged groups, elderly people, people with poor access to technology, getting those people online. So what we thought was a great opportunity to be pushing the case for a much broader form of education about media and culture actually became something much narrower and more specific. It was never really an educational priority. It was a priority perhaps for the regulator, but the regulator was a cultural communications regulator. They never really spoke to the education ministry. It never became a priority in terms of education. And I think this was a general tendency. This is what I've seen internationally. And I think it's quite a problem because in my view, it's the educators that need to be leading this discussion. I'm making the argument not for so much for media literacy, but for media literacy education. Because it seems to me without education, media literacy is an empty gesture. It's what we call in English a matter of paying lip service. We all sit around and we all say, yes, media literacy is terribly important. Oh, yes, we believe in media literacy. But unless you have systematic media education, really very little is going to happen. And very little, I think, in the UK anyway, has happened. I think what that means is that we shouldn't be looking at problems in isolation. There's a tendency to think, oh, fake news, let's have some teaching that will address fake news. Oh, there's a problem with cyberbullying, or there's a problem with online pornography. Let's teach about these things. And the problem is that we just tend to look at these issues in isolation. We look at the symptoms and not the bigger causes. We lose sight of the bigger picture that I was talking about. And we address these things in isolation, in a very fragmented kind of way. So my argument is that if we're talking about media education, what we're talking about is a comprehensive, coherent approach, not a quick fix solution that we imagine will solve the problem and then it will go away. And I think also it's important to say that this shouldn't just be a defensive approach. Very often when people talk about these issues, they tend to think that the aim of media education is to protect children from bad media. And my argument right through my career has been, we need to start by looking at how kids use these media, what pleasure they get from these media, how they get used in their daily lives, and so on. We need to get beyond an approach that is basically about the teacher wagging their finger and saying, these are bad things. This is bad media. Don't go near these bad media. I think we need a much broader kind of view. And we also need a critical framework. We need something that can apply not just to digital social media, but also to older media as well. Now, I think we have that. And at this point, I'm going to speed up a little bit because I warned Elisa that I would speak for too long, and I can already see it happening. So what we have in the UK is this framework. We have a framework of critical concepts, 4 key concepts: media language, representation, production, audience. The media studies curriculum at the top end of secondary school is really organized around these concepts. And I think it's important to say that these are concepts that apply whether we're talking about analyzing media or whether we're talking about creative production. One of the important things to say is that media education is not just a critical enterprise, it's also something creative. It's about getting kids to analyze media, but it's also about enabling them to make their own media, to be creative. But what we want is not creativity for the sake of creativity. What we want is people to be thinking in a critical way about the way in which what they're producing, why they're producing it, how audiences are responding to it. So these kinds of questions, thinking about how media create meaning, thinking about how media represent reality, thinking about how in the wider world media are produced and circulated and distributed and used by audiences. These are questions that apply whether we're analyzing media or whether we're creating or producing media. So, you could look at fake news and, there's a lot to say about this. I think we're in a world now where fake news has become an almost meaningless term. If Donald Trump can accuse everybody of fake news, then the term has ceased to mean anything, it seems to me. I think we need to look seriously at, the evidence for fake news. What is fake news? How are we defining it? How prevalent is it? What do we actually know about the influence of fake news? My argument here, again, would be that we need the bigger picture, because fake news may be a problem in itself, but actually fake news is a symptom more than a cause. It's a symptom of bigger changes going on, changes in politics and also changes in the media business. Because apart from anything else, fake news is clickbait. Fake news is a way of getting you to click online and to give the media companies, the technology companies, your data. So we need to understand fake news in the context of much bigger changes going on. It's really not enough, I think, to say, okay, we're going to teach children to tell the difference between truth and lies, because often the story is more complicated than that. There is black and white, I would agree. There are lies and there are truths, but between lies and truth, there is a big continuum. There are lots of shades of gray between black and white. And so making judgments about that is difficult. I think there's a sense almost that discussing fake news has become a kind of distraction from these bigger questions. We don't really want to talk about the bigger political issues. So what we'll do is we'll just blame the media. We'll blame, in this instance, fake news, and we won't actually then have to talk about the bigger problems. And yes, again, what we have is people saying, oh, media literacy, media education perhaps is the solution to this. And I think the problem is that they tend to think about media literacy or media education in a very simplistic way. It's about checking your facts. It's about dividing the world into truth and falsehood, and then we've solved the problem. And unfortunately, I really don't think that is an adequate response. It's a quick fix, And what we need is something much more sustained and systematic. Okay, I'm speeding up a little bit. So I've been arguing for media education. As I've said, I think one of the problems, though, is that media education or media literacy is often seen as an alternative to regulation. And my feeling is that we also need regulation. Media education isn't just about the individual learning to cope with a changing media world. It's actually also about people demanding change. It's about demanding that the ways in which media operate in society should change. And there are many issues there, but I think we need, in a way, to go back to an idea of media regulation as something that will preserve the public good. We need to be talking in really quite traditional terms here. And I think there are all sorts of questions, lots of issues, which I won't go into, but questions about, for example, political advertising, and how does political advertising work online as compared to older media. We have systems for regulating political advertising in older media, but it seems not so much in new media. I think there are big questions about the ownership of digital media. Those 5 big companies that I showed you. I think there is a question really about, should these effectively monopoly companies be controlling such an enormous part of our media and cultural landscape? Is that actually healthy for society? The absolute bottom line is that I think these people need to be required and forced to just pay their taxes. You know, Facebook and so on are very, very good at evading the payment of taxes. If they paid proper taxes, we would actually have a lot of money to spend on, among other things, educational initiatives. So that, in a way, is perhaps my own fantasy, you know, that we'll tax Mark Zuckerberg and we can put the money into education. But I think there are some big questions here that really need to be addressed, not just through education, but through the regulation of our media system. So this was my manifesto bit, and here are kind of 4 points to take away. I think my first point is that a lot of the anxiety about the change in media is focusing on problems in isolation, on symptoms and not causes. What we need is not a set of quick fix solutions to fake news, cyberbullying, media addiction, whatever problem is concerning you. What we need is media education. It's through a systematic, coherent, critical, comprehensive approach to education that we will be able to address these issues. But education is not enough on its own. We also need reform of the media. Okay, I'm aware now of the time running away. I'm just keep doing this because I'm looking at my watch. So I'm aware that probably I have 10 minutes maybe. We had a little introduction. So if 10 minutes is okay, then I will go quickly. So I wrote the manifesto. I'm now kind of going beyond the manifesto. I'm working on another book. We'll see if I manage to finish it. One of the things that happens is, you know, as I've been talking to you, I talk to people I've talked in many countries around the world. And one of the questions that people always ask is, well, yes, in a way, what you're saying is obvious. I mean, I feel it's obvious. And yet we seem to be making so little progress. And in fact, I would say in the UK, we are now in retreat. Media education, I think, had a pretty good time in the 1990s, in the 2000s, in the last decade. Okay, we now have a different government, and that is a big part of it, but we are now retreating. And why should that be? I mean, we have a world that is more and more saturated by media. Media are absolutely everywhere. We have more and more people expressing concern about media, and yet we're not really making progress. And for me, you know, if I look at technology in education, I wrote a book some years ago called Beyond Technology. And it seemed to me at that time that technology, IT, or in the UK, it was called ICT, Information Communication Technology. People were looking to this as partly a kind of political solution. You know, that governments were very interested in the idea of equipping the workforce with technological skills. This would help us to compete in a globalized economy. And also, obviously, there were commercial companies, technology companies, very keen to get their products into schools. So what we had is technology really pushed into schools before I think anybody had really thought about what were we going to do with technology, how were we going to use it. Technology succeeded, media education fell back. But actually, I also think what we've seen is a retreat of other subjects, other arts subjects, other humanities subjects, social sciences subjects. These are now going down. The numbers of students choosing to study them at the top of secondary school are declining. And the government is absolutely pushing what it calls STEM, science and technology subjects. So media education is failing to make progress, but actually other arts subjects, other humanities subjects are having big problems as well. And I think this is reflective of a general shift in education policy. And part of me just wants to ask, well, you know, policymakers, politicians may say they want a media literate or even media educated population, but do they? The media companies, you know, not just the BBC, but Facebook and so on, they will talk the talk of media literacy. They will say, oh yes, you know, we believe in media literacy, but do they really? I'm not really convinced. So what I want to do in what I'm working on now is to take a longer historical view. I think we need to think about a bigger pattern of change that has gone on in how we think about education and culture. How do we teach about culture and communication, not just media, but culture and communication in schools? This picture is another lovely man. This is Michael Gove, who you may know as the architect of Brexit, who was also the education minister in the Conservative, the coalition government, but basically Conservative government in the early 2000s, and 2010s. And he really was somebody who made a big shift in education policy. This is a lovely picture. It's quite easy to find pictures of Michael Gove looking stupid on the internet, and here's just one of them. So what, you know, we're living in a very changed political climate. You know, we are in the world of Brexit. We are in the world of a kind of what Michael Gove himself called a conservative revolution in education. And this is a general trend. It's what the Finnish educator Pasi Salbo calls GERM. GERM stands for the Global Education Reform Movement. And what is going on in this movement is partly that we're being told a version of history. We're being told a story about what went wrong in the 1960s and 70s, and actually how we need to change the education system. It's interestingly both neoconservative and neoliberal. So it is partly about introducing market logic into education systems. And in the end, I think privatizing education systems. I think that is the very clear agenda that is going on there. But it's also oddly aligned with a neoconservative argument, which is particularly about the curriculum. It's what some people have called restorationism. It's not, in a way, not even conservative. They're not even trying to hold on to what exists. They're trying to go back to something earlier in the story. Michael Gove's favorite educational thinker is a man called Matthew Arnold, who wrote a book called Culture and Anarchy 150 years ago, right? And this is where the ideas, this restorationist, this kind of new conservatism is coming from in education. And of course, then, any more progressive thinking about culture and communication is not going to survive. So what I want to do in what I'm thinking about at the moment is really to think, you know, how did we get there? How did this happen? You know, how have we ended up in the 2020s with a curriculum that increasingly looks like the curriculum of the 1920s or, you know, the 1860s. We're going back to the 19th century, although we're well into the 21st century. Okay, I'm looking at my watch, and I think what I'm now going to do is you're going to see me zip through my slides because I can't get all this done. I'm just going to cut straight to the chase and go to the end. So I'm doing this historical work. I want to look back over really the last 50 years. I want to look from the beginning of the 1960s, and I'm particularly interested in a British thinker on education and culture called Raymond Williams, who at the beginning of the 60s was creating this really quite optimistic agenda of ideas about cultural change and educational change. And I'm really trying to look at, well, you know, what went wrong? You know, how did we get here from where we were then? And it's about telling a story about ideas in education, where ideas in education come from and how they circulate. And for me, it's part of a bigger argument, which is to say, you know, this is about media, it's about technology, but really, actually, it's about culture and communication. It's about having a much broader and more ambitious and more modern idea of how we talk about and teach about culture and communication. So I'm really trying to broaden out my analysis from what I was doing in the manifesto to this bigger set of arguments. So I'm not at this point trying to defend media education or defend the arts or English. What I'm arguing for is this more fundamental rethinking of how we teach about culture and communication. And I think in that we can go back to the past. Actually, we can go back and look at some of the ideas that failed in Britain in the 2000s. You know, there was, for example, a lot of talk about citizenship. There was a lot of talk about creativity. There was talk about literacy. Now, these ideas became fashionable, and then they largely, you know, fell by the wayside. So I think it's about going back and looking at what was useful in those ideas and trying to kind of salvage ideas from them that might be useful. And you can say, well, yes, David, you are just being utopian. You are, if you think that we are going to change how we teach about culture and communication, that's just a fantasy. And I know as I look around at what is going on in education, as I talk to teachers, as I look at the current debate in education in this country, I feel I am a very long way away from what is going on. I guess what I also feel, though, is that we cannot escape from this. It's inconceivable that we will go into the future without a curriculum that actually addresses these issues about media and technology and culture in a broader way. It's really inconceivable that we will imagine that a 19th century curriculum will prepare children for life in the 21st century, because it just won't. So my hope is that, you know, the good ideas will, even if we're struggling at the moment, the good ideas will come back around and teachers will rediscover them. That's my optimistic hope. Okay, a lot of what I've been talking about is on my blog. I try and blog quite substantial little essays every month or so, and you can find me online. And there's also some blog posts, but also some longer essays that are there as well. So with my closing advertisement, I'm going to finish. So Elisa, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much again, Professor Buckingham, for, first of all, for accepting our invitation to speak today and for your wonderful lecture that was really very rich and stimulating. I have lots of questions that I would like to ask you, but since the time has slipped away from us, I'm afraid that we would have to set another appointment to, again, keep dialoguing, and we sure hope to have you next time here in Bologna, because that was our hope to begin with. And the conference, as you all know, will continue. So today, Professor Buckingham started us off, but the conference keeps going with 4 parallel sessions that can all be followed on the Facebook page of DAMS Lab La Soffitta, and also on the website of the dams50.it, where you can find, again, all the sessions and also watch again all of our lectures that took place during those 3 days. So again, thank you so much, Professor Buckingham. It was an honor and a pleasure to have you here. And hopefully we can invite you again in the future to join us here and keep talking about this topic.
Thank you very much. And everybody have a good day.
Thanks. You too. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.